Hey folks, this is Kelani. With a new expansion on the horizon, it's always exciting to look forward and wonder about all of the changes that usually happen to every class when we adventure into the unknown. Every expansion so far has really shaken the boat when it comes to class changes. Most of the time, each class and each spec looks quite a bit different when a new expansion launches. It's been a source of excitement, but also a source of frustration. If you happen to really enjoy how your current class or spec played, then it's understandable if you are a little bit apprehensive of a new expansion because everything always changes. Blizzard has always reinvented the wheel when it comes to classes, even if it wasn't entirely required. So how will Battle for Azeroth change our classes, and what should we expect for the future of World of Warcraft? Before we start, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to help the channel grow, check out the links in the description below. So Battle for Azeroth might be the first expansion where we won't have to start from scratch. Pick an expansion and look at your favourite class. Chances are the expansion made huge changes to the way the class played. There's probably new abilities coming in, new systems which change how your character progresses and how powerful each ability is, talent changes to shake up your rotation, and quite possibly a few skills and abilities were removed. Legion itself revamped pretty much every single class and introduced some crazy concepts for some specializations. Survival Hunter is nothing like it's been in the past, and Disciplined Priest got turned inside out. Every single spec saw huge changes. It was a complete overhaul, but Battle for Azeroth doesn't seem to follow that pattern. We've been told that not much is going to change for a lot of classes going forward. That means if you pick up a Fire Mage right now, that's more or less how it's going to play into the next expansion. Fancy checking out a Boomkin? There's good news if you like it, it's most likely going to play about the same in Battle for Azeroth. This is a huge change of mindset when it comes to expansions. Ever since the announcement, I've been in full expansion mode. I don't necessarily care what I'm playing right now because I want to find something awesome and enjoyable to play in the next expansion. Part of me is craving the beta invites because I want to play around with the new iterations of each class. Except this time there won't really be new iterations, because not that much is going to change. That's sort of mind-boggling. Anything that I pick up and play right now is going to be a good reflection of how it will play in the expansion, and that's really kind of a first for World of Warcraft. Now, I don't doubt we'll see some changes here and there. We're losing two very important systems which affect how our classes play. The first is the artifact system. Whether you love it or hate it, we'll be losing our artifacts in some grand fashion before the end of Legion. Obviously, we'll probably only lose them in the story. I'm sure they'll be taking up a bank slot for the foreseeable future, but that system provides a huge chunk of the new flavour that Legion introduced. There's a whole bunch of passive abilities which aren't exactly all that exciting, but they are a large part of our current power. Take them away and I guarantee you'll see huge differences in ability damage, cooldowns, and overall timing of your rotation. There's also the problem of removing some of our golden traits and the active ability. Beast Mastery Hunters would go back to one pet and lose one of their most powerful abilities. Retribution Paladins lose their largest holy power generating attack. Most tanks will lose a large mitigation cooldown. These are abilities which are pivotal for a lot of classes and specs. That was the entire point. The artifacts were supposed to be powerful and they were supposed to provide awesome abilities for us to make use of. So what happens when you take the entire artifact system away? Normally I would say that's a great opportunity to add in another system which takes over and provides those bonuses in a different way, except we won't be getting a new artifact system in quite the same way. The new Heart of Azeroth artifacts seem to provide stronger bonuses but much fewer overall. We won't have any of the passive increases for sure. Apparently in Battle for Azeroth the talent system will carry some of this power. Things like Retribution's Wake of Ashes or Fire Mage's Phoenix Flames will be added in as talent choices, but that's not going to be the case for everyone. This will happen on a class-by-class basis. If it works for certain specs, then great, fantastic, but some specs could still be losing their strongest abilities and we don't really know what's going to replace them, but something has to fill that gap, which is where class and spec changes usually come into play. One interesting thing to note for Retribution Paladins specifically, the Wake of Ashes talent will currently replace Holy Wrath, putting it on the same talent row as Crusade. I wonder how that will play out because you're either going to have to play without Wake of Ashes or without Crusade, and that's not a very nice decision to make at all. The other system we'll be saying goodbye to for the most part is the legendary system. A few specs only really work properly with the right legendaries, which is kind of silly to begin with, but if you remove those legendaries, will those specs suddenly become clunky and frustrating to play if not many changes can be expected? I know legendary effects are more likely to be replaced by the Heart of Azeroth system than some of the passive artifact traits, so I am excited to see what kinds of abilities we gain access to there. Overall, it kinda seems weird that the dev team would come out and say that not many changes should be expected to a lot of classes or specs, but we do know some things that will be changing which might just be enough to fill in the gaps we just identified. We know that some talents are being replaced and moved around, but I would also expect a few new talents to make their way into the mix. Some talents that we have access to right now just aren't valid choices, or some talents are way too strong to even consider the others on the same row. Some other talents are just kind of broken in what they affect and how they work. Two great examples that come to mind are Surrender to Madness and Crusade. Surrender to Madness is an all-or-nothing, huge risk-reward talent which allowed Shadow Priests to dominate the first few raids of the expansion. And it's a fantastic example of an ability which sort of can't be balanced. Any changes to increase the accessibility of the talent allowed skilled players to go crazy, and when it was altered to try and rein in the top tier players, the lower tier players sort of couldn't use the talent at all. Crusade, on the other hand, is just way too powerful for the most part. The way the talent works focuses the majority of your damage into a very small window, which means to balance things out when you don't have Crusade active, you hit like a wet noodle. If you hit like a wet noodle without Crusade, then you sort of have to choose Crusade. So I would both hope and expect to see a good shift of the current talents we have access to, and I would also love to see another tier of talents added for level 120, instead of just a level shift which moves the required levels and leaves us with the same amount of talents to choose from. Another usual piece of excitement in new expansions is getting to play around with new abilities. As we mentioned earlier, the new abilities in Legion were all tied to the artifacts, but if we're not getting new artifacts, where will our new abilities come from? If the dev team is dead set on not wanting to make huge changes to each spec, does that mean we just don't get any new core abilities? That would be really disappointing. Checking out a new ability and testing how it works with the rest of your kit and your rotation as a whole is a huge part of a new expansion. It would be very sad if we just didn't get anything new. Maybe if we get a new row of talents for level 120, that will be our new abilities, but I would love for each spec to have something as part of their overall rotation rather than just having new talents. Now, we do know that some new abilities will be coming to our spellbooks. Some of them might be old abilities which are just being adjusted and tweaked, and some of them might actually be new, but we know for sure that every class will have access to a raid buff in Battle for Azeroth. The dev team is trying to make sure each class is providing a different buff and to prevent any overlap so you can easily see whether or not you have access to a buff. Having buffs overlap created more of a checklist of abilities and buffs, which they didn't really like, so I guess a checklist of classes works a little better in their eyes, and I can see why. Not having a shaman is a lot easier to see at a glance when compared to a buff which could be shared across several other classes. Though in the past, if you had a hunter, you were pretty much just a-okay. I wonder if hunters will be that wild card again with pets being able to fill any buff slot, or if we'll get something specific this time. Either way, we'll be buffing up the raid before each pull once again, and the initial idea is for each class to provide something unique. The raid buffs might also be a little less significant than in the past, so it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if you were missing one or two. It's still in early days though, so anything could change by the time we get our hands on Battle for Azeroth. Another point of discussion which has come up quite a bit in the interviews scattered across the internet is the utility each spec brings to the table. The goal is to make sure each class brings something different to the table so everyone can feel like they're really good at one specific thing. Now, whether or not the dev team can come up with enough variety of utility to keep the classes feeling different is another question, but they also have said they're going to rein in some of the homogenization that has happened over the last few expansions. So we could see some new abilities added into the mix to help give a sense of purpose to each class's utility, but also see some abilities being removed because they tread too closely on another class's idea of utility. One example we were given is Druids getting Hibernate and Soothe again, so we'll have to see how much they can make use of those two abilities. This could be interesting if it all works out, and I'm excited to see what's in store for our class fantasy, or class utility, in Battle for Azeroth. At the end of this, if you're still panicking because you think a certain spec absolutely requires some major work or changes, don't worry all too much. While Battle for Azeroth isn't opening up every single spec for a complete retool and revamp, class design changes will still continue, but it will be more of what's been happening throughout Legion. If you remember, Discipline Priest got a lot of changes in patch 7.25, and Feral Druids and Frost Death Knights received quite a few changes in patch 7.3, so everything isn't going to happen at once. Instead, a few classes will be targeted in rounds, and while most rotations will still be the same in Battle for Azeroth, the class team will identify which specs are the highest priority to make changes to. So if you think your class is completely broken and everything needs to change, you might actually see those changes if the class team agrees with you, just maybe not with the Battle for Azeroth launch. I actually think this could play out as a huge advantage. Instead of throwing a wrecking ball at what we currently have and trying to piece things together in some sort of coherent way, we'll go forward with what we know already works, and we should see changes in a more surgical manner, really looking at what's going on, what's not working, and fixing that one thing instead of just recreating the entire spec, because that's what happens with a new expansion. Hopefully people wouldn't get too bored with having to use more or less the same rotation in a new expansion, but some of the new talents or abilities might change things up just enough to keep things interesting. Another huge positive I can see from taking this approach is development time. The current plan is to have the beta in our hands sometime early next year, with the expansion itself releasing sometime in 2018. I would put my money on another August release personally. If Blizzard can match the same sort of schedule that Legion had, I think the future for World of Warcraft would be solid. So if we're looking at having the next expansion within a year, imagine the development time that is probably being saved by not trying to reinvent a wheel which is already working pretty well. You don't have to completely change every spec every time an expansion comes out, especially if you commit to making gradual changes to the specs that actually need a bit of love. The amount of development and testing time that must go into the classes and specs when everything changes must be quite a sizable chunk. Instead, they can focus on creating the world we want to explore and making sure everything is ready for an on-time launch so we don't see huge delays, and then working on what comes after that so they can keep the content cycle flowing. So we might not see a lot of sweeping class changes going into Battle for Azeroth, and right now I'm actually okay with that. What about you? Would you rather have every spec be reimagined from the ground up? Would you feel the same if it made us wait a few extra months for the next expansion? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.